Stop what you're doing and pay attention. Because the global economic landscape just flipped overnight. And most of us haven't even noticed yet. China just pulled a move so precise, so deliberate. It isn't just a market shakeup. It's a full-scale realignment of power that could reshape your jobs, your investments, and the price you pay for everyday goods. The question isn't whether this matters. It's how fast can you react before the ripple hits your life. This isn't speculation. This isn't political theater. This is a wake-up call backed by hard numbers showing that the United States is suddenly playing catch-up in a game China is already several moves ahead in. Wall Street is panicking. Policymakers are scrambling. Supply chains the world depends on are shifting under our feet. In the next minutes, you're going to see exactly how China's export shock is rewriting the rules. Why a billionaire investor's bold warnings collapsed in hours, and what this means for the U.S., the global economy, and you. Let's start with what everyone needs to understand first. China's export shock didn't just rattle markets, it exposed how unprepared the U.S. is for a trade war that China is now quietly rewriting. China's export shock didn't just rattle markets, it exposed how unprepared the U.S. is for a trade war that China is now quietly rewriting. The moment the new export data landed, it hit Washington like a sledgehammer. Overnight, long-held assumptions about US leverage, tariffs, and economic strategy cracked open. Markets didn't just react, they flinched. And inside the White House, staffers moved with a kind of sudden urgency that only happens when something you thought was stable suddenly isn't. Because what the numbers revealed wasn't a dip or a crisis on China's side. It was precision. It was strategy. It was a structural shift executed so quietly and so efficiently that almost nobody noticed until the entire global production chain felt the tremor. The shock wasn't the surge or the slowdown alone. It was the pattern. China deliberately pulled back exports in low-margin categories while accelerating shipments in high-leverage sectors. Inputs that the world, especially the U.S., depends on to keep manufacturing lines alive. This wasn't economic chaos. It was targeted economic engineering. And that sent a message louder than any speech or official statement out of Beijing. China wasn't playing defense. China was dictating terms. That's why Bessent's outburst exploded the way it did. When he blasted Beijing early this morning, he sounded like he was delivering a warning America needed to hear. China is manipulating markets. China is breaking rules. China is acting desperate. His tone was bold, confident, forceful. It was the kind of statement that gets instant traction because it plays into a story the U.S. has been telling itself for years, that China is weakening, faltering, and spiraling under the weight of its own economic contradictions. But within hours, the tone shifted. His message softened. Then it fractured. Then it quietly retreated. Because the new data shredded the narrative his attack depended on. The export shock wasn't evidence of collapse. It was evidence of consolidation. China wasn't flooding markets. China was rearranging them. China wasn't losing control. China was tightening it. And the U.S., even with tariffs, incentives, and reshoring campaigns, wasn't ready. Bessent's attack on Beijing collapsed within hours because the data proved China wasn't retreating. It was repositioning, and the U.S. was caught flat-footed. This reversal wasn't about ego. It wasn't about politics. It was about credibility. He couldn't stand in front of cameras and claim China was spiraling when the numbers showed Beijing was executing a strategic trade pivot that strengthened its global position. You cannot argue collapse when the evidence screams consolidation. This is where the structural economic reality hits like a punch to the chest. The United States cannot decouple from the country that feeds its supply chain. Not yet. Not even close. Because the industrial foundation needed to withstand that shock hasn't been rebuilt. Domestic manufacturing capacity isn't ready. Logistics infrastructure isn't ready. Critical mineral processing isn't ready. Even the most patriotic CEOs admit, privately, that the math doesn't work without Chinese inputs. So when China moved quietly, surgically, deliberately, the U.S. didn't have a counter. Move ready, supply chains stretched, prices twitched. Analysts scrambled, and policymakers realized the trade war they thought they were managing had already shifted under their feet. This is the part nobody wants to say out loud. The U.S. spent 6 years escalating a trade war based on assumptions that are now outdated. Tariffs were supposed to weaken China. Sanctions were supposed to isolate China. Reshoring was supposed to rebuild American production. But tariffs didn't break China's export machine. They encouraged China to accelerate its move up the value chain. Sanctions didn't isolate China. They pushed it to deepen ties with Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And reshoring didn't revive American manufacturing. It exposed how much harder and slower rebuilding actually is. China understood this. The U.S. didn't. That's why this export shock was so destabilizing. It wasn't a crisis from China's weakness. It was a demonstration of China's leverage. And Bessent saw it. That's why he blasted Beijing in the morning and backed down by the afternoon. It wasn't indecision. It was recognition. He understood instantly what the data represented. The old us playbook is obsolete. The old assumptions don't hold. The old decoupling strategy doesn't match economic reality because the country with the manufacturing base controls the leverage. And right now, China owns the inputs that determine whether U.S. supply chains survive or choke. Factories in the Midwest don't function without Chinese components. Renewable energy rollouts don't happen without Chinese processing. Construction, electronics, pharmaceuticals, all of them rely on China somewhere in the chain. When China shifts its export composition, the world feels it before it even understands it. This is why the U.S. narrative flipped today. Economists who spent years predicting China's imminent collapse suddenly had to confront a more uncomfortable truth. China isn't collapsing, China is transforming, and it's doing it faster than the U.S. can adapt. This is the moment when the entire trade war framework breaks open, because a trade war isn't won with slogans. It isn't won with tariffs. It isn't won with speeches about American strength. It's won with production capacity, with logistics, with industrial power, with the ability to control the flow of goods that other nations need in order to keep building, producing, and functioning today. China reminded the world who has that power. This is why the stakes feel suddenly higher. This is why the urgency feels different. The export shock wasn't an anomaly. It was a move, a strategic one. And the U.S. now has to respond not to China's weakness, but to China's strength, because the country that moves first in structural shifts sets the terms. And China just moved first. The question now is whether the U.S. can move at all, or whether it keeps reacting to the game China is already several steps ahead in. China didn't escalate the trade war. China rewired it, and the U.S. realized too late that the battlefield had already moved. When the latest export data hit, Washington's confidence evaporated, because the numbers showed a shift so structural, so deliberate. It forced us strategists to confront a truth they've been dodging for years. China is no longer reacting to American pressure. It is redesigning the global system around itself. And the moment that reality became undeniable, panic replaced politics. The real story isn't Beijing's aggression. It's Washington's outdated playbook, colliding with a China that now controls the supply chain choke points. Every sector the U.S. depends on, energy tech, manufacturing inputs, critical minerals, traces back to China's industrial core. So when Beijing makes a move, it's not symbolic, it's operational. And the U.S. is still fighting the last war while China is already shaping the next one. Wall Street didn't react to China's export shift with confusion. It reacted with fear because the data showed Beijing tightening its grip on the sectors the U.S. can't afford to lose. Investors immediately understood what policymakers didn't. China wasn't signaling weakness. It was demonstrating control. The shock wasn't that China moved, but that America had no counter move ready. Exposing a vulnerability officials have avoided admitting, with critical supply lines still anchored in China. The U.S. found itself reacting, scrambling, and suddenly very aware that the leverage it thought it had was never really there. Bessent's retreat wasn't just a personal backtrack. It was proof that even the loudest U.S. critics can't ignore the structural reality China now controls. Analysts watched as his narrative unraveled in real time, because the numbers left no room for speculation. Beijing isn't collapsing, it's consolidating. Every tariff, every threat, every trade war strategy is now being measured against a China that has quietly shifted the balance of economic power. The country that once reacted to US pressure is now the one setting the tempo, forcing Washington to chase a game it no longer leads, and Wall Street to price in a reality that officials have struggled to publicly acknowledge. The export shock is more than numbers. It's a wake-up call showing the U.S. is structurally exposed in industries Beijing now dominates. From EV components to critical minerals, China's control over essential supply chains gives it leverage Washington cannot match with tariffs or rhetoric. China's pivot flips the trade war narrative. The story is no longer about U.S. leverage. It's about who controls the global supply chains of the future. Every strategic move, every policy debate, and every market reaction now has to contend with a reality where China isn't just a competitor. It's the hub that shapes who wins and who scrambles. The reality is clear. China's export pivot has rewritten the rules of the global trade war, exposing vulnerabilities in U.S. supply chains, Wall Street, and even policy assumptions we've relied on for years. The stakes aren't abstract. They touch your job, your investments, and the very structure of the global economy. Understanding these shifts isn't optional, it's essential. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and recognize that economic power is moving. And those who grasp it first will shape the next decade. This is USA World Reports, where we bring you the truth behind the headlines and the insights you need to navigate a rapidly changing world. Thank you for watching. If you found this report eye-opening, like, comment, and subscribe to stay ahead of the global story, and don't miss our next video, where we'll break down what China's next moves could mean for the U.S. economy and your financial future.